The Hundred Years' War illustrates the waning of feudalism. Feudalism is a term coined by historians to describe the governmental and military systems of the Middle Ages. Feudalism is characterized by a decentralized system of sovereignty and power. Final authority rested with a local ruler, and he had the power, unchecked, to discipline and punish, judge his local population. This system evolved after Rome retreated from the West. Local warlords and their vassals took control over vast areas of Western Europe, but they could not control and coordinate activities in the way the Roman Empire could. And so this resulted in a fragmented system of sovereignty and power. Each person in the system had a fiefdom. A fiefdom was a seat of power. It could be small, like a modern day county, or it could be large, like a modern day state. At the top of a system of vassals and lords was a kingdom. Kingdoms, like fiefdoms, varied in size depending upon who recognized a local person as a king versus just a duke or an earl or a viscount. This was a system of personal responsibility and property. There was no sense of public in feudalism. Lords and vassals owed their allegiance to themselves and to their families. So in this system, allegiance was manifest itself in service of a vassal to a lord. More than likely, that was military service, but it could also manifest itself in a form of ransom. So if a king or a lord got in trouble, got captured on the battlefield, his vassals should pay ransom to get him out, right? This is the famous story of King Richard during the Crusades, who got caught on his way back from the Crusades, and his brother John raised money as a ransom to get Richard out. John gets in trouble because of this, because John doesn't use the money to pay the ransom. Marriages were a way for lords to solidify allegiance from their vassals, and marriage was also a way for vassals to build up their fiefdoms, because it was not uncommon for lords to have multiple titles and multiple fiefdoms. This leads to problem and fighting or feuds. Most of that fighting and feuds happened over inheritance. Each fiefdom passed from father to son. And so it was very important for a feudal lord or a vassal to have an heir. Not always possible. So marriages were meant to build a family so that a family could be strong enough to grow their personal property holdings and then pass it on to the next generation. This eventually leads to self-destruction. Feudal lords and feudal vassals fought over sovereignty, they fought over power, they fought over property, and they end up destroying themselves. That's where we come to the 100 Years' War. Often this is seen as a conflict between England and France, but that's not really true. It is a conflict between the Normans and their French lords. The Normans were vassals to the French kings. That relationship between the Dukes of Normandy and the French kings became complicated during the Norman conquest. William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, was cousin to the Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor. When Edward died, William the Bastard claimed the throne of England. So he was already Duke of Normandy, and because his cousin died, he wanted to be King of England. Edward's vassals in England, however, didn't want a Norman king. They preferred a local English nobleman, Harold Godwinson. He was the brother-in-law of Edward the Confessor. So if we put up this family tree, this royal pedigree, we see that Edward Confessor is there in the middle, and he married Edith. Edith is the sister of Harold Godwinson. If we go back up the family tree, we see that William the Conqueror then was a cousin to Edward the Confessor. So this is a family dispute over inheritance and property. That the fiefdom, the Kingdom of England, passed generationally from father to son. Edward had no children, and so you have two rivals to the throne. William the Conqueror, as his name suggests, ended up winning this and then establishing himself both as Duke of Normandy. He keeps Normandy, one house, and he then conquers and takes a second house. And in that, he is King of England. Eventually, his descendants build up not only their kingdom in the British Isles, but they also, through marriage and through inheritance, build up an Angevin empire on continental Europe. So if you look at this map, you see that the Kingdom of England is pink, and then there are pink areas in what is today France, and it was inside of a Kingdom of France. The dark blue area is the area of the royal domain. That area was the territory directly controlled by the King of France. So this 100 Years' War then is a war between a king and his vassals. This was not a war between England and France. Yes, there were Englishmen on one side, and yes, there were Frenchmen on the other side, but this was not a war between peoples. This is a war between a warlord and his vassal. As Duke of Normandy, the King of England was supposed to bend the knee to the King of France. But as you can see on the map, the Duke of Normandy had a lot more territory than the King of France. So on one side was House Plantagenet. This is the King of England. And the other side was the House Valois. That was the King of France. Eventually, through this 100 Years' War, the King of France was able to acquire more and more territory as his royal domain, and then pushed the King of England out of France until only a small area of France remained aligned with the King of England. The Battle of Crécy seemed like a defining moment in this 100 Years' War. In that battle, French knights, the traditional fighting force, charged into English longbows, piercing through the knight's armor and giving a clear advantage to foot soldiers over horse soldiers, because it was much cheaper, less expensive to field an army of bowmen versus an army of knights. But this was a Pyrrhic victory because the Valois dynasty was able to rally support, and Joan of Arc in support of Charles VII, and they fought and drove the English out. But they weren't driving the English out. The French king defeated his vassal, the Duke of Normandy. By accident of history, the King of England happened also to be Duke of Normandy. This battle then was a battle between a king and his vassals. The noblemen, the feudal lords of France, fought each other, divided as in a civil war, and eventually wore themselves out. And so, as a consequence of this 100 Years' War, the feudal lords self-destructed. And it opens the door to a stronger monarchy. There's a stronger monarchy in France. There's a stronger monarchy in England. This 100 Years' War helped turn the tide on decentralization and unintentionally opened the door to more centralization. So here in the 14th century is the waning of the Middle Ages. Feudalism wanes in the Middle Ages. Local lords lose power to kings. That's a story of modernity.